heading. It's heading towards some real, like I said, real life scenarios and applying the law in real life sort of scenarios in terms of the cadastral law exam. The professional challenge will be wider than that though, but we haven't landed on exactly what the content of the professional challenge is going to be, but we're working on that at the moment. And then once you've completed that professional challenge, the third step in the new process is going to be a professional interview where we're going to pick up on any weaknesses or concerns that have come out of the portfolio of experience in the professional challenge, and we'll also be testing professional conduct and communication skill competencies along the way. So coming back to the cadastral law exam is what we're here all about today, is that we decided to, the licensing board in consultation with Surveying and Spatial, decided to change the format of the cadastral law exam this year. So it's heading in more towards the direction of where the new assessment framework is going. In other words, putting it into a real life situations. So I'm going to hand over now to the examiner, who is going to explain to you in a bit more detail how that's going to work. And before I do that, I hope that you're all familiar with the first broadcast, which was a couple of weeks ago, about the fact that the cadastral law exam format is changing. And it's important in that broadcast, it gave you direction as to what bits of legislation will definitely be covered compulsorily and what bits of legislation will be covered where you'll be able to choose a certain number of them. So there is going to, well, I'll move on to the examiner now, and he can sort of carry on from here. So I'll hand you over to the examiner, and like Nikki said, at the end of the examiner's presentation, there'll be some questions and answers, so it'll be an open forum. You can ask questions directed at the examiner or myself, whatever you like. So I'll hand over to the examiner.
Thanks, Neil. There's just sort of following on from what Neil said. I've got some notes here that I was going to talk about, and one of the big things was that these previous exams. So this won't look like any of the previous exams. It might look a little bit like last year's, but we're definitely moving away from that format. And I'll just sort of I'll talk about why, and then I'll talk about what type of questions you might be looking to sort of get. So so we all know that the official website for Legislation New Zealand is www.legislation.govt.nz. So there's not really much need anymore for us to require chapter and verse recital of things. Anybody can go there and find it. So because the internet, everyone's got the internet at their fingertips, so this should be bookmarked in every practicing cadastral surveyor's web browser. So rather than sort of getting you to do that, we're going to be doing something that's a little bit more practical. So last year's feedback, there were two things that Neil touched on. I'm just going to go over them again. One was the relevance of questions. We received about 3 or 4 pieces of feedback about the relevance of the questions, and the other thing was the stated scope of exam material. Okay. Nobody's really sort of come out and talked about this, but I can tell you that it ended up being irrelevant. We actually ended up to gift some of those marks, but this year we're going to make sure that the scope is going to be pretty clear, but it's also got these extra things that we mentioned in the first note that went out a couple of weeks ago. As examiners, we have a lot of trouble asking questions where we're looking to try and say, tell us about this section of the Act, because so many sections of Acts are simply something like this has the meaning attributed to it in section something else of some other Act. And so a lot of those questions can't be asked directly. And so we couldn't then go and say, well, we'll extend the scope out and add another part of another Act just simply so we could question that. So we're wanting to get well away from that this year. And as Neil said, one of the most important things for us now, which we've probably been ignoring in the past as well, is the rules that have been set by the CSLB. That's sort of tertiary legislation, if you like. And it's the primary guiding document that we need to be working to going forward, rather than just sort of randomly picking land law and putting questions in there. So we're looking to test concepts. So an old question would have looked something like this. Sections 17 to 23 of the Reserves Act 1977 list the 7 types of reserves. Name 5 of them, and you get, a couple of half marks or 5 marks or something along the lines for that. So you'd have to try and remember section 17 to 23 and have to remember what these 5 out of 7 of that. This year, if we were to ask a question from the Reserves Act, we're not. The question might look more like this: which of the following is not a primary classification of a reserve? And we could have something like list all that apply. So instead of simply copying something that you remembered by, rote learning a section, you're actually having to think about some of these other things that might have gone in there that could be wildcards from something that's completely irrelevant, or something from another act that might be close to it, but it's not quite right. There'll be very few very few section promptings I've written here. Now, what that means is last year's exam, we basically had to tell you every single section of every single act. So we would say exactly that question, as I said, we point exactly to that section. There's going to be very little of that this time around, because we're going to be, the way we're going to be doing it is more about looking for the concepts, the processes, and the systems, which are the things that are listed directly in the CSLB rules that we're working to. Other questions that were impossible for us to ask last year were things like an excerpt from a resource consent. I'll give you a hint. It's probably one of those in there this year, given that the RMA is going to be a compulsory question this year. So last year we only had the rules and the act as a compulsory question, and the board has said to us that by looking over the years, they've been looking and seeing what's been coming through, and the RMA needs to be tested a bit more heavily, and it needs to be front and center in any surveyor's sort of legal toolkit. So things like being able to put a copy of a consent in there and then question around that was very hard for us to do that last year without literally pointing to a section of the act and say, this thing is this, and what does the rest of the section say? So you'll find it in a different format, but that doesn't mean to say that the answer won't be found within the scope that we gave you a couple of weeks ago. Every year we put in challenging questions. There's no surprise. And so the challenging questions previously have had to have resorted to really obscure stuff, or really complex concepts that happen to be sort of buried within the acts. This year, the challenging questions are going to be more of a test of the practical experience that the candidate has had in terms of interacting with planning law, land law, the law relating to the practice of cadastral surveying, and working with the LINS standards. So this is more hand in glove with the comprehensive professional qualification system that is being developed by the board, and a lot less like a first-year university paper. So this is a postgraduate test that's happening here. You've all got degrees or equivalent qualifications. This is a higher level test, so it needs to be more connected. We are working with Otago University. In fact, we have worked with Otago University in the past as well. So we're going to make sure that the questions are not ambiguous. So there will, if a question appears in this year in the exam, there will be no query as to what we're trying to say. And so that's something that we looked at last year. When we have to mark these things, sometimes we were having to look for keywords, and we marked it very laterally because of the way that some of the questions were asked. This year, there's going to be a lot less sort of ambiguity around that. What have I got? What do I have here? Oh, so the other types of questions that you might see are yes, no's. So there won't be too much interpretation on that. It's either yes or it's no. And that's it. So there will be yes, no questions, which enables you to sort of move through pretty quickly through the exam, rather than sort of having to sort of dwell on it and come back and try and remember, oh, what was that fifth point that they were trying to get me to write down, as well as that multiple choice. There will be graphical questions. We're visual people. Surveyors work with diagrams, they work with plans, they work with documents, not, things like records of title and instruments of crown title, resource consents, as they pertain to subdivision. No one's going to be sitting there and asking you a question about a discharge permit. You can figure that out in your professional life, but we're really focusing on the subdivision side of things here. And there may even be graphical questions around land online capture processes and survey plans as well. We're just wanting to, it's the sort of work that you would be exposed to as a graduate surveyor. So yes, I said the graphical questions. So once again, last year, the only graphical question we were able to put in was that one from the Unit Titles Act, because it was actually listed. But you expect to see more graphical things. One thing that came up when we're talking about this was the mini assignment. Now, some of you, I'm not sure, Nikki, whether you know or not, a few years ago, there was a mini assignment, and in lieu of the cadastral law exam, they did it the other way around. The mini assignment had a lot of benefits because it really got into some of the processes, but we simply can't do that type of thing without an open book in a 2-hour format. So don't worry, you're not going to get that level of questioning in this exam, but it will be more like that than it will be reciting chapter and verse. We're looking, so you expect each question to tell a story. Okay, so I'm giving you guys a few hints here, but I think it's going to help you not only to study, but also to understand. So you will expect the rules for cadastral survey, LIN's standard 70,000, which is the lodgement for cadastral survey data sets, and the RMA to feature in every question. So there is a compulsory question for the RMA that will be question 2. But sprinkled throughout, these concepts are going to be there as well. They will not be outside the scope of the study that we announce shortly, which narrows down the parts of the acts. But these sorts of questions are around the context of applying the RMA. So this is to achieve 3 things. We've got comprehensive connected knowledge, which is one thing that if questions that are asked, this thing out here doesn't connect knowledge. We want to reinforce the importance of the RMA to the surveying profession, and we want to focus on getting it right the first time for lodgement of CSDs with LINs. So the Survey and Spatial New Zealand in recent communications talked about how it was really going to be working towards that. Well, that's going to be part of what we're going to be putting into our exam questions. So how will we mark it? So even in previous papers, we actually had a degree of flexibility in the answers, believe it or not. We didn't simply look there, and if it didn't meet the model answer, you got 0. We sort of really went out there and to try and get the concepts. Things like we might look at the keywords, for a public purpose, or to the centre line of a watercourse, or something like that. No one except judges and barristers and strangely planners quote the law word for word. Okay, everybody else just has interpretive statements based on the legal intent. And even LINs, although LINs is work that they've got, their knowledge based on their website, does actually get right into the law. They have these interpretive documents which are very good, and that's sort of how we operate. That's how we operate as a profession. So I've talked about the word for word. There will be a few word for word questions, but we'll be talking about concept, system, process. I'm repeating myself a little bit here. So I can probably close off with probably what my honest advice is for you guys going into this, guys and girls. What does it mean to the candidate? Number 1, if you don't know what you're doing, it's probably best not to sign up for the exam. Be really honest with yourself. That's the first thing. Spend the next few months getting familiar with the lodgement for standards, the rules, get some exposure to records of title, instruments of crown title and resource consents, and the various forms of tenure that have been hinted at in the study material so far. Speak to your supervising surveyor or mentor, because they do play a role in this. And finally, go to www.legislation.govt.nz to get the latest versions of the acts and the secondary legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Examiner. I just thought I would pitch in, sorry, Nikki, before we head to questions and answers. The Examiner referred to the Licensing Board's rules. What he was actually referring to was the standards and competencies, and in particular the competencies, because that's really the focus of where this cadastral law exam is heading and where the new assessment framework is the basis for the new assessment framework. It's very much going to be focused around the competencies. And there was one reference, I think, to the mini assignment referred to. That was the pre-2017 format for the cadastral law exam, where there was a mini assignment as well as a cadastral law exam. And that is what I guess the examiner was referring to. So I hope that answers Nikau's question. If not, sing out Nikau, but I guess I'll hand it over to you, Nikki, for the question and answer session.
Yeah, so I guess if anyone's got any questions, I guess you can put it in the meeting chat, or feel free to just open up your mic and shout out in the meantime. If there's none at this session, you can email the YP group and we can address it at a later date as well. So I'll just, I guess we've got one question come through. How many marks will each of all the questions carry?
So at this stage, we've got, it's actually quite heavily, we've got 20 marks on the rules and the Act and the Cadastral Survey Act. We've got 20 marks on the RMA as a dedicated compulsory question. And we have got the remaining 60 marks is going to be either 3 out of 4 or 3 out of 5. We're just still working through that at the moment.
Cool. There's another one here. There was a mention of the Cadastral Survey Rules 2021 and the RMA for the mandatory questions, but what about the Cadastral Survey Act 2002?
Yes, sorry. The Cadastral Survey Act and the rules are in the first compulsory question. That's right.
Perfect. A few more here. What is the question structure? 2 hour / 3 hour? How many big questions?
So I believe we're with a 2 hour, it's a 2 hour format, Neil. It's always, I believe it's always been a 2 hour format, or can someone correct me if I'm wrong there?
But I believe that's right.
Yeah, probably going to allow an extra 10 minutes for reading if that wasn't already allowed for. So yeah, it's the same as what we've had previously. I don't think we need to go to a 3 hour exam. Yep. But this time you probably won't be able to take the question paper home with you. That's probably the only difference.
Cool, thank you. Another one here. Will one single question include multiple sections of one piece of legislation?
Will one single question include multiple sections? Yeah, definitely. So in the guidance that we sent out there, those are, and we narrow it down a little bit for you, we'll definitely be focusing on those acts and those processes and systems. But within those questions, you will also get those other 3 things sprinkled through that we've talked about. They won't be the bulk of the question. They won't be the bulk of the marks, but there will be questions in there from those other 3 things, which is the rules, the RMA, and what was the third one I said? The Cadastral Survey Act. The LINS S+7000. Sorry, the standard for lodgement. Yep. Those are the 3.
Cool. is there a cutoff date for legislation in case there are amendments or changes, etc.? i.e., what if there was a change to a part of legislation tested in the exam? Would we need to know about that up to, say, 2 weeks before the exam?
I'm probably going to say no. I mean, it would be as at the date that we do this second announcement, Neil, because that's the date that we have to sort of say as a strike date. If it turns out there's an amendment to the legislation between when we set the exam, or when we announce the study material and we set the exam and then actually have it out there, then there might be actually two answers possible for a question. But I can't imagine that what we've got in there is going to be changed in any way, great way, shape, or form. In this election year, the biggest chance you had was actually losing the RMA altogether, and that's gone. So
I would suggest that if there was a change happening, there would be a broadcast to everyone about that, and the questions wouldn't be rewritten in terms of the brand new bit of legislation. They would continue under the old bit as they've been written.
Yeah.
Would that be right, Examiner?
No. It would have to be something pretty wholesale for us to change it. But then again, at the very last minute, we can change the question so that they've got the correct answer. We can just say to candidates, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, I think, Neil.
I guess just to reiterate what the examiner was saying, there is another broadcast coming in the next week or so, which will drill down on the particular parts and sections of the legislation that the questions will be directed at.
Yeah. So where we got all the questions coming thick and fast now. No, that's all cool. That's all cool. What have we got there? So next one was Spencer Holmes. I can see the queries here. How many further questions? It's either going to be 3 or 4, but to make up the 100 marks. So 40 marks will be compulsory questions, and the other 60 marks will be a choice of either 3 out of 4. Yeah.
Cool.
It might be better, Nikki, if you read out the question so everyone knows what the answer is to what the question that is being answered.
All right. Yep.
Cool. So yeah, you just addressed how many other pieces of legislation will be there. The next question was, will these changes make the exam easier or harder?
Well, I think if you've got a photographic memory and you're able to just read acts and just spurt words, it's going to be much harder for you. But if you've got what we're testing here is an understanding of concepts, processes, and systems. That's what we're really testing. So if you know your concepts, your processes, and your systems, then you are probably going to find it slightly easier than in the past. It all depends on how you've gained your knowledge, built up your knowledge, and yeah, it's not simply it's not a recollection exercise, it's an application exercise. So I don't know whether that answers your question there, but that's about all I can really say. Might be easier for you, might not be.
Cool. The next one here, just sort of shortening it a bit, is that they just wanted to check that they wouldn't have access to the legislation while sitting the exam. No, they won't. No, that's not happening. The reason why your lawyer friends are doing that is because legal exams ask questions in very different ways, and you really need to be able to have access to the legislation in order to be able to answer the question. Here, you just have to be able to remember parts of it and apply it in these concept systems and processes.
Yeah, I think the key to that is the application of the cadastral law to a particular situation. That's right.
Cool. The next one was, will there be an exam preview out? Neil, you just touched on that one. Can you confirm that Reserves Act and Conservation Act have been removed from scope?
So the scope that we sent out a couple of weeks ago is the broadest that it will be. And so whatever was listed there, we will narrow down And I'm not going to say we're going to remove things that are surplus to requirements, but what I am going to say is we're going to narrow down. So we've literally just listed the acts this time around at the moment. So we will narrow down the parts of the acts that we're interested in. But generally speaking, we're not really concerned about things like, the Environment Court's role in dealing with a contamination issue or something like that. So there'll be great big swathes of the RMA that we just don't care about. So you can, if you've got that cadastral surveying hat on, then you're probably pointed in the right direction for all of these acts.
Excellent, thanks. If the cadastral law and the RMA are worth only 40%, how can you say they are more important than other acts?
Neil?
I think the answer to that question is that, as the examiner said, there are those two compulsory portions worth 40%, but there'll be smatterings of them throughout all the other questions as well. So I think the 40% is probably a little bit of a misdirection, I guess. Like there will be in the other questions, as I understand, examiner, there will be RMA components to some of the other questions, but they'll be also asking about some of the other acts. Yes,
that's right. So it's not that they're only going to get a sort of 20% weighting. Because you'll find things about them in the other questions that you'll find it stacks up pretty quickly and ends up sort of getting closer to 50%. If you don't really know those, things, the rules, Lynn's standard 70,000 and the RMA, then you're going to struggle to pass.
And the other reason that the two compulsory questions are those particular acts is that if you have a look at the competencies and the licensing board standards, you'll see there's a real focus on the RMA and the subdivision process, and etc. And relevant cadastral law. There's some direction in those competencies as to what those focuses are in terms of that legislation.
Excellent. So here's another one for you. Do you think the exam questions will be more in line with how the earlier exams were set out, like 2003, 4, 5, etc., as these were situation based?
What can I say to that? I'd like to say I bring my own style to the exam. So I could probably just leave it at that. We're talking. The situation-based thing leads back to that whole mini assignment thing, where it was a sort of more around putting a scenario in front of you to sort of solve a problem. I think that's probably going to be a little bit harder to test, but there definitely will be a story involved in each question. Yep.
Cool. And following on from that, I think we sort of touched on this one already. When can we expect the narrowed down scope?
That should be the end of, it should be the end of next week, I think, which said Easter and stuff like that's knocked us around a bit.
Excellent. I see Andrew Perry has listed some guidance there. Did you want to add anything there, Andrew?
No, I think I just put it in there if people were wondering what we were talking about, which ones and those two compulsory questions, but also reiterating that Lynn's 70,000 standard as well, which was all in that communication we sent out on the 28th of March. So have a read if you haven't seen that already.
Excellent, thanks, Andrew. Another one here, so just clarifying, still a 60% pass mark is necessary?
Yeah, that's been the standard in the past. I don't know if there wouldn't be any reason to drop it to 50, would there, Neil?
No.
Cool. Do you expect us to look into the Natural and Built Environment Bill and the Spatial Planning Bill?
Oh, I thought about it. I really did think about it, but because it's got a fair bit, it's got a long way to go, and there's going to be a hell of a lot of discussion on that one. No, there will not be anything that is no bills will be tested. No.
Cool. And here we go. Would you consider releasing a set of preview questions so we can get a better idea of how the exam is going to be structured?
Oh, that means I'd have to write a whole new exam with around completely different acts that we're not testing. It doesn't sound like fun.
The answer is no.
Cool. And the last one I've got so far, past exam papers used to be a powerful tool for preparation, but this year it doesn't seem the story. What is the examiner's suggestion?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a fairly fair point. And I certainly recall when I was doing exams in university, it was the same. You sort of look back previous years. But no, it's really going to be what I said before when I just closed off with my advice. It's going to be, spend the next few months getting familiar with those key documents, LIN's 70,000 rules and the RMA, which we will narrow down for you. Get exposure to records of title, instruments of crown title, resource consents, and understand the various forms of tenure that have been hinted at in the study materials so far. That's really all I can say for this, because we can't release preview questions unless I have to just sort of make some stuff up. And even then, if it doesn't, it might not meet your expectations. So it's probably best just to let it sort it on the day. But it's really about understanding those the CSLB standards. It's really about understanding those three things I just mentioned. It's really about talking with your supervising surveyor mentor and getting exposure to those sorts of things. That's really all I can say, and that's really how it would be in most sort of postgraduate testing. Project management one, for example, they just go and read the project management book, the big textbook, and we can ask you any question from that, and that's literally their study material. So at least I'm sort of saying to you, we're talking about practical application as you guys may have come across it up to this point in your career.
Just to carry on from the examiner's comments there, I think in the presentation today, the examiner's given you some pretty good hints at what to expect. There's going to be, for example, the last year there was the unit title family tree sort of scenario in terms of the Unit Titles Act and subsidiary unit title developments, etc. And there's going to be more focus on getting some more graphical stuff in there, and you being asked questions on that sort of thing.
Yep, that's right. Yep. Oh, some more questions have popped up. I thought we were done. We've got a few more. Yep, get into it.
Yeah, so the next one was about giving some guidance with the exam questions, as they had no idea what to expect. But I think you've given us a steer that that's not an option. So,
well, I mean, I did give an example of what it would have looked like in the old way, which is try and remember these sections of the acts and just write it down on a piece of paper. And the new one is some of these things are from those acts, and some of them are from somewhere I just completely made up. Which ones are real? That type of question, and yes, no questions. So it's going to be, yeah, you're still going to have to know how it works. Yep.
Cool. The next one we've got here is things like new MDRS rules are above most people. They have to refer to planners for advice. You're not going there. RMA 1991 could infer a bucket load of additional documents. Yeah, no, look, that's an interesting point.
So we're just sticking with the principal acts. There was some talk about talking about things like national policy statements and things, but I believe there's going to be enough testing under the current setup through the licensing board that those sorts of things will pop out during the projects or the assignments or the professional challenge or what have you. We're certainly not going to get into those those heavy planning questions will not be the focus of this exam. To me, that's not cadastral law. That's planning stuff.
Cool. I think that sort of flows onto the next one. I'll read it out anyway in case you've got anything to add. Does familiarity with resource consents take into account national environmental standards, policy statements, or other national matters which often apply?
Yeah, so we're going to keep away from anything that is not written principally in the Acts or in any of the or the secondary legislation that we've listed, or the LINS standard.
Excellent. We've just got another one back through for asking for an example question.
Do you want me to write you one now? I'll stick it up and you can see what I'm talking about, because it literally we're talking about the application. We're not talking about what the question will look like. There's going to be less, and there may be a couple of questions that are similar to in style to the previous exams, but that's just a style of question. Like the content that I've listed is what you need to be able to connect the dots between. That's probably the big thing here. You've got to be able to connect the dots between the relevant parts of the Acts, the records of title, instruments of crown title, resource consents, forms of tenure, LINS 70,000, and in the rules. Those things you've got to work out how to connect them together. So that's really what this is all about. So all the questions will talk about how things connect together, which is why there's a story involved. They won't be totally isolated. Look, I'm going down the Reserves Act. I found section 4. Cool. I'll just ask a question on section 4, because that's literally how we had to do it previously. And then we'd run out of sections. It's not going to be like that. It won't be. So a lot of the random stuff that you've seen previously that doesn't really pertain to the systems, the processes, the concepts, just won't be asked to fill in marks, you know. You're also a mate. Oh, jeez.
Question in between. Will there be any Zoom meetings hosted by some professionals on the outlined Acts? I know that the Cadastral stream are looking at pulling together some of the different previous webinars that have been around the different branches. So that is coming your way. Is there anything else in particular? I'm not too sure, other than at a branch level.
We haven't. Obviously, I can't host any study sessions, can I? No, I think it's the branch needs to sort of probably work out how they're going to do that now that they've got the feedback, I would think.
And yes, I think I definitely know that the Cadastral stream is working on issuing some webinars there. But there is no other questions. The last one is, will you be posting this recording? I have recorded it at this moment. Are you happy for us to share that, Neil and Examiner?
Oh yeah, no worries. Yeah, I think you can sit there and try and work out. There you go. There's your example question that I'm not going to ask you. All right.
I'm sure, Nikki, we can put the recording on the Survey and Spatial page and put a link in the next comms that's coming out to everyone.
Cool. Well, that's awesome. Well, if there's no more questions for the moment, you can still, I guess, filter them through the YP group, and I can direct them to either Neil or the Examiner. But I'd just like to say, on behalf of the YP group and those sitting the exam, thanks for the Cadastral Licensing Board and Survey and Spatial for running this session. I imagine there's been some valuable insight into the exam, and I wish you guys sitting it all the best of luck.
Thank you.
Anything else
Cheers,
you
guys.
need there, Neil?
Yep.
No, that's good. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks.
Cheers, guys.